Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Growing up, I learned early that fairness was nothing more than a word people used when they wanted to sound reasonable, but never actually practiced when it mattered. My parents had always made it painfully obvious that my younger sister, Ashley, was their favorite, not in a way that was blatant enough for them to acknowledge outright, but in every small decision, every carefully worded excuse, and every obvious difference in how we were treated. If I wanted something as a child, I had to earn it, prove that I deserved it, make a compelling case as to why it was worth the cost, and even then, the answer was usually no. But when Ashley wanted something, there was never a question of whether she deserved it or whether it was too expensive, because her happiness was apparently a family priority that ranked far above anything I might have wanted. When I turned 16, I spent the entire summer working at a local diner, saving up every tip, every miserable paycheck, just to afford a beat-up used car that stalled at every other stop sign. My father had stood in the driveway when I brought it home, shaking his head, muttering about how I should have just waited until I had saved up for something better, completely ignoring the fact that I had no choice but to take what I could afford. 2 years later, when Ashley turned 16, my parents surprised her with a brand new car, complete with a big red bow on the hood, a moment straight out of a holiday commercial. With my mother wiping tears from her eyes while my father ruffled Ashley's hair and called her his little princess. When I had pointed out the stark difference in how we were treated, my mother had sighed dramatically and said, "We didn't want her to have to struggle the way you did." As if my struggles had been some kind of accident rather than a choice they had made over and over again. The pattern continued into adulthood, widening the gap between us, making it clear that while I was expected to be self-sufficient, Ashley was allowed to remain under their financial umbrella indefinitely. It wasn't even that I needed their help. I had built a life for myself that I was proud of, worked hard to earn everything I had, and never once asked them for anything. But it was the principle of it, the unspoken message that Ashley's needs were always going to be more important than mine, that her comfort would always take precedence over fairness, that I was seen as capable while she was seen as deserving. Thanksgiving dinner had always been a mandatory event in our family, one of those non-negotiable obligations that I had never been able to escape, no matter how much I wanted to avoid the inevitable conversations about my career, my personal life, or the endless comparisons to my sister. This year was no different, the dining table laid out with an elaborate spread, my mother beaming with pride at the perfectly cooked turkey, my father already a few drinks in, laughing too loudly at one of his own jokes while my sister scrolled through her phone, barely paying attention to anything happening around her. It only took 15 minutes before Ashley dropped the bombshell, a casual toss of words that she knew would be received with excitement, admiration, and absolutely no scrutiny. "So, I'm going to Greece in January," she announced, flipping her hair over her shoulder as she grinned, the light catching the expensive earrings that I had no doubt had been a gift from our parents. Mom and Dad thought it would be a great way for me to reset after such a stressful year. I raised an eyebrow, my fork pausing midway to my mouth, knowing exactly where this was going but asking anyway. "Stressful how?" I asked, because as far as I knew, Ashley had been working part-time at a boutique, spending most of her time posting carefully curated Instagram photos and complaining about how exhausting her schedule was. Ashley rolled her eyes, waving a dismissive hand. "Ugh, you wouldn't understand," she said, laughing as she leaned back in her chair. "Retail is way harder than people think, and besides, it's not just about work, it's about needing time to reflect and figure out my next steps." I glanced at my parents, waiting to see if either of them would acknowledge the absurdity of what she was saying, but instead, my mother reached over and patted Ashley's hand with a warm smile. "You deserve this, sweetheart," she said, her voice filled with nothing but encouragement. "You've been working so hard, and we just want you to take the time you need to focus on yourself." I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to smile, feeling the familiar weight of frustration settle over me like a blanket. "So, they're paying for it then?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral, though I already knew the answer. My father laughed, shaking his head as if I had just said something ridiculous. "Of course we are," he said, grinning at Ashley. "You know how expensive international travel is these days, and we wouldn't want her to worry about money when she should be enjoying herself." I nodded slowly, setting my fork down as I leaned back in my chair, choosing my next words carefully. "That's interesting," I said, my tone deceptively light. "Because I remember wanting to take a trip after college, and you told me that if I wanted to go anywhere, I should use my own money, since I was an adult and needed to learn how to be responsible." My mother sighed dramatically, already annoyed with where this conversation was going. "That was different," she said, her voice laced with forced patience. "You had a great job lined up, and we knew you could afford to do it on your own. Ashley's in a different situation, and we just want to make sure she has the support she needs." Support she needed. Those words echoed in my head, bouncing around until they settled into a place where I could store them alongside all the other times I had been reminded, explicitly or implicitly, that Ashley's needs would always come before mine. I turned my gaze back to my sister, watching as she smirked, knowing she had already won, knowing that this was just another instance in a long history of my parents enabling her entitlement. I could have fought it, could have made a scene, but I had learned long ago that nothing I said would change the way they viewed us, that no argument could shift the way they had already decided to distribute their affections, their money, and their loyalty. Instead, I let out a slow breath, picking up my wine glass and forcing a tight smile. "Well," I said, lifting my glass in an exaggerated toast, my voice dripping with false enthusiasm. "Here's to fairness." No one responded, the words hanging in the air for a moment before the conversation awkwardly shifted to something else, my parents eager to move on, Ashley completely unbothered, and me, sitting there, swallowing down years of resentment, knowing that this wasn't over. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for the perfect moment, my mother sighed, shaking her head as she reached for the mashed potatoes. "Ugh, honestly, your father and I are so stressed about the mortgage right now," she muttered, waving her fork in the air. "But I'm sure we'll figure something out." My grip tightened around my glass, and for the first time all evening I smiled. Because something told me that they weren't going to figure it out. And that meant their golden child wasn't the only one about to get a wake-up call. It had started subtly, creeping in like a slow-moving storm that no one wanted to acknowledge, small shifts in conversation that felt almost inconsequential at first, until they weren't. My father, who had always been quick to brag about his financial security, began making offhand comments about tightening the budget and cutting back on unnecessary expenses, though he never quite explained what that meant. My mother, who used to shop without a second thought, had started hesitating before making purchases, putting things back on shelves with a forced smile, as if pretending it wasn't a big deal would somehow make it true. But the biggest clue had been Ashley, or more specifically, Ashley's complete and utter obliviousness to the fact that our parents were struggling. Her extravagant lifestyle remaining completely unchanged despite the warning signs that were becoming harder and harder to ignore. She still went out to dinner at expensive restaurants, still flaunted designer handbags in her carefully curated Instagram posts, still booked spa appointments and weekend getaways as if money were something that existed in an unlimited supply. It was almost impressive, the sheer level of detachment she had from reality, the way she floated through life completely insulated from consequences, as if the idea of financial hardship simply didn't apply to her. But then again, why would it? Our parents had spent her entire life making sure she never had to face the kind of struggles that had been expected of me from the moment I became an adult. The first real crack in their carefully maintained facade came a few weeks after Thanksgiving, during an uncharacteristically tense phone call with my father, who had called under the guise of catching up but had spent the entire conversation sounding vaguely distracted, his voice laced with an underlying stress he clearly didn't want to admit to. He had asked about my job, about whether I had any upcoming projects that would keep me busy, and though it had seemed like small talk at first, something about his tone had made me pause. The way he lingered on questions about my career, making it clear that he was leading up to something else. It wasn't until he let out a heavy sigh, one that sounded almost reluctant, that I knew where this was going. "Your mother and I are thinking of selling the house," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a man who wasn't used to admitting when things weren't going as planned. "It's just getting a little too expensive to maintain, and with everything going on in the economy, we figured now might be a good time to downsize." I hummed in response, not saying anything right away, because I knew better than to take his words at face value. My father was many things, but he wasn't the type of man to make impulsive decisions, and he certainly wasn't the type to give up something he had spent years working for unless he had no other choice. This wasn't about downsizing. This was about survival. But I didn't push, because I knew he wouldn't tell me the full story, at least not yet. So instead, I played along, nodding even though he couldn't see me. "Makes sense," I said casually, keeping my voice light. "Real estate prices are pretty good right now. You'll probably get a decent offer if you decide to sell." He let out another sigh, this one heavier than the last. "Yeah," he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. "We'll see." I hung up feeling uneasy, the conversation sitting in the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't quite scratch. My parents had spent my entire life projecting an image of stability, of effortless success, of financial security that was never supposed to waver, and yet, something was shifting, something they clearly didn't want me to know. And then, a week later, I got the text. It came in the middle of the afternoon, while I was at work, a simple message from my mother that, at first glance, seemed harmless enough. But as soon as I read the words, my entire body went still, the familiar sting of resentment curling in my chest like a slow-burning fire. "Mom, hey sweetheart, I know this is sudden, but your dad and I are in a bit of a financial bind right now. We wouldn't ask if we weren't desperate, but the mortgage is due soon, and we're really struggling to come up with the money. We were wondering if you could help us out, just this once? Ashley can't contribute, and we're running out of time." I stared at the message, reading it over again, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things, just to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. But the words didn't change, and neither did the meaning behind them. They were asking me for help. They were asking me to fix their problems the same way they had always fixed Ashley's, the same way they had never even considered fixing mine. For years, I had been told, repeatedly and without apology, that I didn't need their help because I was independent, because I was successful, because I could afford to take care of myself. And yet, the moment they found themselves in trouble, the moment they needed something they couldn't get from Ashley, they had turned to me without hesitation, as if the years of neglect, of second-place treatment, of barely concealed favoritism had never happened. I could feel the bitterness rising in my throat, thick and suffocating, pressing against my ribs as I clenched my phone in my hand, my fingers gripping the device so tightly that my knuckles turned white. They hadn't asked me for help because they valued me, because they respected me, because they saw me as an equal part of the family. They had asked because Ashley had nothing to offer them. And the worst part? They hadn't even tried to hide it. I took a deep breath, inhaling slowly, exhaling even slower, forcing myself to think, to really think about how I wanted to respond. Every instinct in my body told me to fire back with all the anger I had bottled up over the years, to remind them of every instance where I had been cast aside, to throw their own words back in their faces and watch as they scrambled to justify their hypocrisy. But that wasn't enough. That wasn't satisfying. I wanted them to feel it, to really feel it. So I started typing, carefully, deliberately, making sure every word hit exactly the way it was supposed to. And when I was done, I hit send. Then I waited. Because for the first time in my life, they were finally about to learn what it felt like to be on the receiving end of indifference. I stared at the message on my screen, the words glowing in the dim light of my office, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I debated how exactly I wanted to play this. My mother had spent years carefully crafting the perfect narrative in which I was the capable daughter, the one who never needed help, the one who had been left to figure things out on her own because I was strong and independent, while Ashley had been fragile, helpless, too delicate to navigate the real world without their constant financial and emotional support. And now, after all those years of reinforcing that story, she had suddenly decided that I was the one she needed to rely on, not because she had finally recognized my value, but because her real priority, her actual concern. The child she had spent decades bending over backward to accommodate had nothing to give. I felt something cold settle in my chest as I let the full weight of that realization sink in, my anger not burning hot, not seething and uncontrollable, but sharp and calculated, simmering beneath the surface with a patience I hadn't even realized I was capable of. If they had asked me for help a decade ago, maybe even 5 years ago, I might have said yes, desperate for their approval, desperate to finally hear them say that I was enough, that they appreciated me, that they saw me. But I wasn't that person anymore, and their desperation had arrived far too late. So I did what they had always done to me. I made sure my response was carefully measured, painfully direct, and utterly indifferent to their suffering. I started typing, my fingers moving with precision, crafting each sentence with the same level of thought that my mother had never bothered to extend to me when she repeatedly reminded me that I wasn't entitled to the same level of care she so easily handed to Ashley. Me. Hey Mom, I get that things must be difficult for you and Dad right now, but I have to be honest, I can't say I'm surprised. You spent years telling me I didn't need help, that I was strong enough to figure things out on my own, that I should be grateful for my independence. And you know what? You were right. I am independent. I did figure things out. I built a life where I don't have to worry about money, because I worked for every single thing I have. But you didn't teach Ashley those things. You shielded her from every consequence, gave her everything she wanted, and made sure she never had to struggle for anything, and now, suddenly, you're realizing that she can't support you the way I could have. That's not my problem. That's yours. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. I stared at the words, my pulse steady, my heart rate unchanged, feeling nothing but a quiet, steady satisfaction as I pressed send. Then I waited. I watched the little read notification pop up beneath my message, and yet, the seconds passed, then minutes, then an hour, and still no response. Not a single justification, not an attempt to guilt-trip me, not a dramatic plea for me to reconsider, just pure, deafening silence. And that silence, that complete and utter absence of words, was more satisfying than any argument could have been, because for the first time in her life, my mother had absolutely nothing to say. I went about my evening as if nothing had happened, cooked dinner, watched a movie, answered a few work emails, and yet, every time I glanced at my phone, my mother's silence remained, stretching across the hours like an unanswered question. But I knew it wasn't over. I knew she wasn't the type to let something like this go without calling in reinforcements. And I was right. At exactly 10:42 p.m., my phone buzzed with a new message, and before I even looked, I already knew who it was from. Ashley. The words were short, clipped, but overflowing with barely concealed rage, the kind of anger that comes from someone who has never been told no, who has never experienced a world where they aren't the center of the universe, who has never been forced to live with the consequences of their own entitlement. Ashley, what the hell is wrong with you? How could you do this to Mom and Dad? They need help, and you're just going to sit there and act like you don't care? You're being selfish, and honestly, I feel sorry for you. We're family, but I guess that doesn't mean anything to you. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head as I reread her words, barely suppressing a bitter laugh at the sheer audacity of her message. She had spent years reaping the benefits of my parents' favoritism, never once stopping to consider how it might feel to be on the other end of it, and now, the very moment things weren't working in her favor, she was suddenly throwing around words like family as if it had ever been a concept that truly applied to me. I took my time before responding, making sure my words were measured, deliberate, and designed to cut straight through her delusion. You're right, Ashley. We are family. And you know what family means? It means supporting each other equally, not just when it's convenient, not just when it benefits you, and not just when it's easy. I spent my whole life being told that I was strong enough to handle things on my own, while you were given everything on a silver platter, and now that Mom and Dad need something, they've suddenly decided that I should be the one to fix it. That's not how this works. If you care so much about them, why don't you help? Or is it only my responsibility when things get hard? I pressed send, expecting another instant reply, expecting an explosion of anger, expecting a desperate attempt to turn this into my fault. But instead, just like my mother before her, Ashley went silent. And that was when I realized something: she didn't even know about the debt. She had no idea how bad things had gotten. And now, she was about to find out. The pounding on my front door was so loud and relentless that, for a moment, I thought Ashley might actually try to break it down with sheer force alone. I hadn't expected her to show up unannounced, hadn't expected her to be this enraged. But then again, Ashley had never been one to handle rejection well, and after my last message, I should have known that she wasn't going to let it go without getting the last word. With a sigh, I set down my coffee, took a slow breath, and pulled open the door, only to be met with the sight of my sister standing there, wild-eyed, face flushed with anger. Her arms crossed so tightly over her chest that it looked like she was physically trying to hold herself together. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she demanded, her voice sharp, cutting, filled with the kind of righteous fury that only comes from someone who has spent their entire life believing they were owed something. I leaned against the doorframe, completely unbothered by her theatrics, watching as she struggled to contain whatever storm had been brewing inside of her since my last message. "Well, hello to you too, Ashley," I said, my voice calm, measured, deliberately neutral, because I knew it would infuriate her even more. Her lips curled in frustration, her fingers digging into her arms as she glared at me. "Mom is crying," she spat, emphasizing every syllable as if that alone should be enough to make me crumble, as if my mother's tears had ever held any weight when it came to me. "Dad doesn't know what to do, and you're just sitting here, acting like none of it matters." I raised an eyebrow, letting her words settle in the air between us, giving her enough rope to hang herself with before I even bothered responding. "That's funny," I said slowly, tilting my head just slightly. "Because for years, every time I needed something, every time I was struggling, every time I had to figure things out on my own, no one cared how I felt about it. But now that it's them, suddenly it's a crisis." Ashley scoffed, rolling her eyes as if I were speaking in another language, as if the very concept of me having a valid point was too ridiculous to consider. "That is not the same thing," she snapped, her voice rising, her anger bubbling over into something almost theatrical, exaggerated in a way that suggested she was desperate to make herself believe her own words. "Mom and Dad always did their best for us, and you," she exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You just love playing the victim, don't you?" I felt my jaw tighten, my nails digging into the palm of my hand, but still, I kept my expression perfectly composed. This was exactly how it always went: Ashley rewriting history in real time, Ashley refusing to acknowledge the years of unequal treatment, Ashley acting as though my frustration was some kind of petty jealousy rather than the result of a lifetime of being overlooked. I took a slow step forward, closing the space between us just enough to make sure she heard every word I was about to say. "You think I'm playing the victim?" I asked, my voice quiet, deliberate, laced with something that wasn't quite anger, but was so much worse: undeniable, irrefutable truth. "Let's talk about that then. Let's talk about how, when I turned 16, I had to get a job to buy my own car, while Mom and Dad bought you a brand new one without hesitation. Let's talk about how, when I wanted to go on a trip after college, they told me to save my money because I was an adult, but when you wanted to go to Greece, they paid for every last cent of it. Let's talk about how every single time I needed something, I was met with lectures about independence, responsibility, and hard work, but every time you wanted something, it was given to you like it was your birthright." Ashley's mouth opened slightly, like she wanted to argue, wanted to throw something back at me, but no words came out, because she knew I was right. But still, she wouldn't let herself admit it, wouldn't allow herself to acknowledge that everything she had ever believed about our family was built on a lie. "That's different," she said finally, but the words sounded weak even as she spoke them. I laughed, the sound humorless, shaking my head as I turned away, stepping back inside, leaving the door open just enough so that she would have to follow me in if she wanted to keep fighting. "Of course it's different," I said, moving toward the kitchen, grabbing my coffee, taking a slow sip just to let the silence stretch long enough to make her squirm. It's always different when it benefits you, isn't it? She stormed inside, slamming the door behind her, her breathing heavy, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Mom and Dad love you just as much as they love me," she snapped, her voice shaking slightly, like she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince me. "They did their best, and you're just being bitter because you think everything has to be exactly equal all the time." I turned to face her fully, leaning back against the counter, my eyes locked onto hers, watching her unravel. "No, Ashley," I said, my voice low but unwavering. "I'm not bitter because things weren't equal. I'm bitter because every single time I asked for something, I was told no, but every single time you asked, the answer was yes. And now, after all these years, after they have spent every last dollar making sure you never had to struggle, they finally need something from me." Ashley's breath hitched slightly, her fingers twitching, a flicker of something dangerously close to realization flashing in her expression. And then I delivered the final blow. "You want to know why they didn't tell you about the mortgage?" I asked, watching as she stiffened, as her eyes darted away for just a second before snapping back to mine. "Because they knew you wouldn't be able to help. They knew you had nothing to offer them. They needed me. And they never planned to pay me back." For the first time since she had arrived, Ashley had nothing to say. Her lips parted slightly, her throat working like she was trying to swallow down the weight of what I had just said, her shoulders tensing, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. And then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out. She didn't slam the door. She didn't yell. She just left. And for the first time in my life, I knew she finally understood. For 2 full days, my phone remained completely silent, as if my parents and Ashley had collectively decided to retreat into whatever delusional world they had been living in, hoping that ignoring reality long enough would somehow make it go away. I imagined my mother pacing the kitchen, wringing her hands, whispering furiously to my father about how she simply couldn't believe I was being so heartless, about how she had raised me better than this, about how I was supposed to take care of family like any good daughter would. I pictured Ashley sulking in whatever luxury apartment she was currently living in, rereading our last conversation over and over again, desperately searching for some way to twist my words into a justification for her anger. Some excuse that would allow her to continue believing that I was the villain in this story. But eventually, the silence broke, just as I knew it would. And when it did, it wasn't an apology, it wasn't remorse, it wasn't even an acknowledgement of everything I had laid out so clearly for them to see. It was exactly what I had expected, a guilt trip, carefully worded to make them the victims and me the cold, ungrateful daughter who had abandoned them in their time of need. My mother's message was short, but it carried the same emotional manipulation she had perfected over the years, the same soft-spoken cruelty disguised as disappointment, the same insidious attempt to turn this all around on me. "Mom, we just thought you'd help your family, that's all. We never imagined you'd turn your back on us like this, especially after everything we've done for you. But I guess we were wrong." I read it twice, feeling the bitterness rise in my throat, feeling that old familiar sting of anger clawing its way through me, but this time, it was different. This time, it didn't hurt, because I had already made my decision, because I had finally let go of the need to be seen, to be appreciated, to be valued by people who had never truly cared about my struggles. I had spent my entire life watching them lift Ashley up while letting me fend for myself, and now, at the moment they realized their golden child was of no use to them, they had the audacity to turn to me, expecting me to fix everything as if the last 30 years had never happened. And I was done playing their game. I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of my final words settle in my mind before I typed them out, making sure every syllable carried the weight of decades of being the afterthought, the second choice, the expendable child they had only ever seen as a backup plan. "Me, you thought I'd help because that's what I was always supposed to do, right? Because I was always the responsible one, the independent one, the one who didn't need anything from you while Ashley was given everything she wanted. You raised me to handle my own problems, to never expect help from anyone, to figure things out on my own, and that's exactly what I did. I built my own life, my own security, my own future, while you kept Ashley sheltered, kept her comfortable, made sure she never had to struggle. And now, the moment you need something, the moment you realize the daughter you actually invested in has nothing to give, you come running to me, expecting me to clean up your mess. But you taught me well, didn't you? You taught me to handle my own problems, just like I was supposed to. And now, it's your turn. Figure it out. I hit send and let the silence stretch once again, knowing that this time, I would be the one leaving them speechless. But Ashley? Ashley was not the type to stay silent for long. It took less than an hour before her name lit up my screen, and I already knew what it would say before I even opened it. Ashley, I cannot believe you are doing this. Mom and Dad are losing the house, and you're just going to sit there and act like it's not your problem? What is wrong with you? You're so obsessed with being right that you don't even care about our family anymore. You're just bitter because they didn't give you as much attention as you wanted, and now you're punishing them for it. I hope you're happy. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head, not out of frustration, but out of complete exhaustion at the sheer predictability of it all. Even after everything, even after being confronted with the truth, even after realizing that she had never actually been the one they could rely on, Ashley had still chosen to side with them, to dig her heels in, to pretend that this was all just some childish grudge rather than the natural consequence of years of unbalanced loyalty. And that was the moment I truly knew that nothing would ever change. So I didn't reply. I didn't argue. I didn't waste another second trying to prove anything to people who had already decided that I was the villain in their story. And as it turned out, they were losing the house faster than they had expected. A month passed, and I heard through mutual family members that my parents had officially defaulted on their mortgage, that the bank had finally called in the debt they had been ignoring for far too long, that their days of sweeping their financial problems under the rug had finally come to an end. They had lost everything, and Ashley, the daughter they had spent their entire lives prioritizing, protecting, and enabling, was now the only person left to pick up the pieces. And as I had expected, she couldn't handle it. She had never paid a real bill in her life, never been expected to budget, never learned how to survive without someone holding her hand. And now, for the first time ever, she was the one struggling. She was the one who had to figure things out. And she had no idea what to do. And I did nothing. I watched from a distance, detached, indifferent, completely unbothered as they scrambled to fix the mess they had spent decades creating, knowing that none of it was my responsibility. One morning, I sat by my window, coffee in hand, reading an email from a client, my life completely untouched by their chaos, my world completely separate from theirs in a way it had never been before. And I smiled. Because for the first time in my life, I was completely free.